I suppose start with the equipment that I've got. So first and foremost is the Boston tin. So these are obviously very, very important. And as many of you may already know, this is where you're going to be shaking your cocktails. And there are a couple of different kinds of Boston tin. There's one that comes with a built-in strainer, which I'm not so much a fan of. They're just a bit cumbersome. And I'll be getting onto a strainer later on, which is a bit more versatile. And you also get ones where the smaller one is made of glass. And I don't really like these as much because, for one, if you're working in a busy bar environment, which I suppose you're not going to be you're probably not going to be, most likely even, um, then you're going to be chilling down this and then heating it up very quickly by washing it out in a sink. And so by making it very cold and very hot repeatedly, and it's the thing made of glass, you can imagine that sometimes they break. I've had one break on me before, and because they're quite thick glass, they can cut your hands. So I like them being like this, and also they're of equal weight, so it's easier to move them around. I mean, closer to equal weight. Obviously, they're not equal; they're different sizes. But get off my back, all right? So they're also well balanced, which is part of the charm. So if I were to put them together and pretend to shake them without anything in, it doesn't feel out of balance in my hand. Whereas sometimes it can with a glass one because it's much heavier than what I presume to be aluminium. So I like having them both the same. You don't have to do that. If you're at home and you've got a glass one and you'd like to see what's going on in your shaker, then that's fine. But if you know what you're doing, you don't really need to see. It's like being a really good chemist, and you've done this process lots and lots of times. You know what's going to happen. You don't need to observe it. So the next thing is obviously a spoon, and this is a bar spoon in particular. And you may notice two things about it, or three things really. It's very twisty. That's important. It's got a flat bottom at the end, which is basically for if you have something like champagne and you're making a champagne-based cocktail, rather than pouring the champagne straight into the champagne flute, you pour it down this spout and it clings to here and then dissipates here. So imagine this was a champagne flute. I know it's not. You pour the champagne into here. When it's on the ground, you hold it in one hand, you have the spoon in the other. It goes down the shaft, and then as it hits this flat bottom there, it dissipates without bursting too many of the bubbles. And that's always very useful. And the main purpose of this, and the main thing you'll be doing, is stirring, as you can probably imagine. But they're also very useful as well if you're making a fruit twist, to make a sort of flat thing of fruit peel. You twist it round, and then that allows you to have a nice shape to make that twist without having to manually faff about with it. You just wrap it round the spoon. So next is the fine strainer, which you put over the top of the big Boston tin, and you pour it out so that you get the liquid without any of the old ice. And the whole purpose of doing the straining in the first place is so that you get fresh ice in the drink. So you shake with different ice than you pour, and this is to prevent any dilution of your drink. Some drinks, it's less important because dilution actually helps it. Some are designed to dilute as time goes on, and I think some of them can certainly be improved by being a bit weaker, particularly the alcohol-heavy ones. But it very much depends on your taste. I think the one thing that I really want to hammer home here is that there isn't necessarily a correct way of doing things. Is the sort of done way in bartending, but it's similar to sort of music in a way, in that the more you learn, the more you find that actually the best is sort of contained within the exceptions to the rules. And there are a few cocktails that I make that I'm not talking about today, where I might take a different method than is conventionally taught in some of the top institutions, but it just means that I've made it lots. I know how to make it to my taste, and that's what it's all about. If it tastes good, then it works. That's my motto anyway. I think that people can get a little bit too pretentious about it. It's just like, oh, you've got to make it this way or that way. And sometimes actually there's a lot more hassle than it's worth, and you can't really tell the difference. Or sometimes it'll actually be better to do something unconventional. So telling you all these rules, but it's not necessarily always that important to follow them. Also, you may have seen these in bars on top of bottles. It's just a pourer. I'm going to be putting this on bottles just because it's easier to measure something without spilling. You may notice I'm in the main studio, and I don't want to be the person who gets alcohol all over the monitors underneath this table because I'm spilling everything and making a mess. So I'm definitely going to be careful with these. They're not really so important if you're pouring at home on a worktop where it doesn't really matter, but it's good not to waste stuff. And if you're in, say, an actual bar environment, not using these makes a massive difference because of all the wastage that accumulates. So if you're saving money, they're always useful. You can just take it off the top, put it on another. Very easy. And finally, well, penultimately, actually, we have our pouring jigger. Got to be careful how you say this in a crowded bar environment. I've had it before where I've said to one of my colleagues, "Oh, have you seen any of the jiggers?" And uh, uh, an urban gentleman thought I said a different word, and it was very awkward. And I said, "Oh, no, no, I was on about these." And he was like, "Oh, okay." So yes, not a good word to say in a loud room, but these are obviously for pouring. I actually prefer the kind you get in bars more often, where you've got your 25 mil and your 50 mil. They also have I think it's a 5 milliliter on the bottom, so that you can do the finer denominations. But this one I've got with the cocktail set I brought from home has a 50 milliliter and a 25 milliliter, which I think if you want it in imperial measures, 25 mil is 3 quarters fluid ounces, and 50 mil is 1.5 fluid ounces. But I'm going to be talking in milliliters because in Britain, at least, even though we have lots of imperial measures, we like to do everything to European standard when it comes to drink measures. And that's how I've been taught. And it'd be very difficult for me to unlearn. So I'm going to be talking like that. And, as long as you've got the measures in mind, you'll be able to translate. But again, it's another thing. How strong or weak you want your cocktail is your preference. You can make it to the book once you know the method and then sort of work your way towards what you prefer. So you can put less alcohol in, put more in. It's up to you. So finally, we have a muddler. I'm not going to be using this, but this is basically used to crush up things like fruit to make, believe it or not, fruit juice. It can also be used to crush ice, although it's a bit difficult, and I'm not going to bother with that because going to the trouble of making crushed ice for your cocktails, unless you've got a machine that does it for you, is not really worth it. I actually prefer cubed ice in almost all instances because crushed ice just melts too quickly. And even though I drink my drinks relatively quickly compared to most people, you can taste the dilution a lot more in the crushed ice. So if you want something to be watery quite quickly, it might be the way to go. But more often than not, just add water to it and add crushed ice if that's really what you're going for. It's not that difficult. Just add a teaspoon, maybe a shot glass worth of water in there, depending on the cocktail, of course, and it should be fine. So now on to the glassware, and this can be considered by some to be quite important, but I'm sort of a bit more laissez-faire about it. As long as the glasses somewhat resemble one another, it kind of works. As long as it tastes the same, I don't really mind. So I'm not going to be one of those snobs who's just like, oh, you've got a I don't know, Negroni in a highball glass. How terrible! As long as it tastes the same, as long as it's what you want, who cares? That's what I say. But I'm going to walk through them anyway, just so you know roughly what's what. And this sort of graphic here that I've found online has got a lot more than you need to know. Basically, you need to know a sort of set number of types, but you can get by with 3 or 4 different types of glass, and it's fine. So you've got your highball, zombie, and Collins glasses. They're all sort of tall glasses, a bit like this one here. I think these are Collins glasses, crystal ones. But you can make pretty much any cocktail. The only difference is the actual fluid ounces that can fit in there. It depends very much on, if you're trying to make them to industry standard or not, which doesn't really matter if you're making them for fun. So don't worry about it. Obviously, you've got your different kinds of pint glasses. We're not talking about those today. Most people are pretty familiar with them. You've got an old-fashioned glass, which is like this one. So it's sort of a heavy glass bottom there, and very flat. This is a Lotus Eaters one as well. So you've got that. There's also a rocks glass, which is, as you can guess, it's just a glass which you drink spirits on the rocks with ice. But you could just call it a tumbler glass, which is similar to it anyway. That's what I used to do, just call them little tumbler glasses, because either or really as to which you drink spirits out of. Then you have, some people have a cosmopolitan specific glass. I think it can go in a martini glass just as well. Same with the margarita. And in fact, I'm going to be making the margaritas with martini glasses because it doesn't really matter. They're basically the same thing. Hurricane glass is a good one for a pina colada and cocktails like that, quite often tropical glasses. Then it goes through all of the wine glasses that no one really cares about. Most of the time, if you're buying the spirit, you know which glass goes with it. Obviously, you've got the coupe, which is a sort of similar thing to the martini glass. You can I found that was much better at making sort of iced cocktails that had been sort of crushed ice that had been blended, almost like what's the word? Got brain freeze, ironically. No, what's it called? Like a slushy, right? That glass lends itself quite well to a sort of martini style cocktail that is a slushy because of the curved edges. So that works relatively well. But it goes into lots of other glasses like the cure and shot and all that stuff, and a snifter. We don't need to know any of this stuff. Just basic stuff here. But I wanted to walk through it just to go and basically make the point that all of these glasses, it's not a religion. You don't have to get every single one perfectly right depending on the cocktail. No one cares. As long as it's roughly right and you're not making, massive vats of martinis or tiny quantities of tequila sunrise, then you'll be fine. So the first cocktail we're going to be making is probably one of the most famous but least drunk cocktails going, and that is the Vesper Martini, as outlined by Ian Fleming, who, of course, wrote the James Bond series, and he came up with it himself. I believe the direct quote is 3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, half measure of Kina Lillet, shake it very well until it's ice cold, and then add a large thin slice of lemon peel. Got it? That's in chapter 7 of Casino Royale, which of course was made into a film, which many of you have probably seen, including myself. I think the first thing to introduce is the gin, because Gordon's gin, at the time of Fleming writing, which I think was 1953, was a very different recipe than what it is now. It had a lot more botanicals in it. It wasn't as cheap. It wasn't as, it isn't the front shelf gin that you might expect today. And so instead, I have some Plymouth gin, which is not only sentimental to me because I've walked past the distillery hundreds, if not thousands of times. There's a very good restaurant opposite it, by the way, and they also do tours. They're not paying me to say that. But yes, this is pretty close to home as far as it goes. And also it's world-renowned. So you're going to find this pretty much everywhere. I was on holiday in Prague. I went to a speakeasy there. They had Plymouth gin on their shelf. So you should be able to find it. And it's also quite good. I'm not necessarily a gin man, but just to give you an idea of how good it really is, it has more botanicals than a lot of London gins, which tend to be drier. And the distillery is the oldest in England. I believe it's been in use since 1793. So there you go. If you care about heritage, that's a good start. It's also worth mentioning that the British Navy, in particular, Admiral Nelson used to swear by it. He would give each of his officers a barrel, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, as well as the fact that by 1850, the Royal Navy, the Royal British Navy, when we owned quite a large empire, used to order over 1,000 barrels of Plymouth gin a year. So it must be good if it's the gin that fueled the men that built the empire. Not that I'm trying to sell it to you, but I'm not sponsored by anything here. In fact, it's cost me a lot of money to make this video, so please help me. So yes, it's a good gin. It's got juniper in, as do all gins. That's one botanical. That's not really notable. It's also got coriander, which gives it a hint of citrus and sourness and a little bit of spice. Cardamom, which gives it a hint of menthol. And it also has angelica, which gives it a sort of dry finish and an element of sweetness to it. And of course, a little bit of lemon as well. So the vodka doesn't really matter so much. You won't be tasting it all that much. As long as you don't get really cheap vodka. I've got some sort of reasonable mid-range vodka. I've not really heard of it before. But the general rule with vodka is the better it is, the less you can taste it. And I think in a drink like this, that can be important, but also you're not putting in enough that it's that stark. So it really depends on your preferences here. But I've gone for the mid range. It doesn't really matter. You don't need to get really expensive vodka unless you're drinking it straight on its own. If you're mixing it in cocktails, that's the sort of joy of vodka, is that it blends in very well without being too intrusive. So you can get away with not necessarily getting the best, which is kind of why I've gone for that. Onto the Lillet Blanc, which I have here. So obviously this isn't the same, exact same one as listed in Fleming, but this is a tonic wine, and it is a French apéritif, meaning an alcoholic drink which you take before a meal to stimulate the appetite, which is my favorite way of drinking, is before, when you're waiting for your food. Always good. It's a shame we don't have that sort of tradition of a traditional spirit to have beforehand, because I'd like that. But the Kina Lillet was discontinued in 1987, and that had quinine in, which is also used to treat malaria, but it also made it slightly more bitter than this. This is actually much sweeter than the original, which actually works in the context of this cocktail far better, because the one thing that I find in a cocktail that's only booze is that you want as much sweetness to counteract that as possible, because if you have bitterness and the alcohol taste, it's not very nice. It's you really have to have quite a refined palate to get used to that sort of thing. So yes, this is 85% Semillon grapes from the Bordeaux region of France and 15% fruit liqueur. So to run through the ingredients for this cocktail, all you need is 45 ml of gin, 15 ml of vodka, and 10 ml of this Lillet Blanc, and then you garnish it with a lemon twist. So through the magic of editing, I'm going to go get some ice. Now I'm back with some ice and a martini glass. You may notice something about this martini glass as well, in that it's covered in ice. And the trick to this is you pour water on the sort of cupped part of the glass and then stick it in the freezer, and it keeps the cocktail cooler for a lot longer without very much trouble. So if you've got space in your freezer, you know you're going to be having a few martinis. What you do is you just pour it on the inside and the outside of the glass, keeping the sort of stem of it clear so you can hold it. And that way it keeps the cocktail cooler without having to shake it an unnecessary amount of time to cool the liquid, because of course you don't have any ice in a martini unless it's specifically designed around it. So let's get to adding some of the ingredients, shall we? All right, vodka. So I'm going to have to kind of be eyeballing this a bit, because it's measures that my measuring glass does not go up to. If you have one of the smaller ones with the 5 milliliter, you can do it a lot more precisely than I can, but at least I have the experience to judge it rather than getting it wrong. I hope that's the right amount. I think that was too much, wasn't it? I did 45 ml of vodka rather than gin. I'm off to a bad start. So it is 15 ml of vodka, so that should be about that much. Okay, so 45 of gin. I'm just going to do 125 ml and then 120. I think that'll be easier. That's 125 ml. That's about 20. So that's in there. And then 10 ml of this, the Lillet Blanc. I'm just going to pour this straight in because there's only a little bit of an amount there. and spill it a bit. See, that's what I said about the pourers. You gotta get them right. There we go. I'm gonna leave that in there ever so briefly, just to show you how to do the lemon twist. So all you need to do is get your knife, get it under the skin. It doesn't necessarily matter if you get a little bit of the rind, so we can cut that off in a bit. So you just cut that off so you have something looking a bit like this, and it already smells great. And all you do is you cut off the curved edges and you turn it into a sort of rectangle, like so. Then slowly and gently cut the rind off, which is a little bit fiddly. Try not to block it. There we go, move that out of the way. So just slowly moving the knife over the top. It's very difficult to do this with a microphone in front of your face and with your hands there, but you just put your fingers in top and just gently move it across until you get all of the white off. It should be very intuitive. If you've ever cooked anything ever before, you should be able to do this. You know, it doesn't need to be perfect. So you're not eating it, are you? You're just putting it in your drink for flavour. But generally speaking, I want you to at least know how to do it right. So I'm not teaching you poorly. Yeah, that's good enough. And so this is where the bar spoon comes in. You just put it down here and just wrap it around the bar spoon. It gets a bit of a curve to it. Now, mine's not that long there, but it doesn't really matter. It's going to impart its flavour all the same. But if you want to make it look particularly fancy, make it long and thin and very twisty, but it actually doesn't taste as good that way, in my opinion. But anyway, time to shake this up. I shouldn't have left it in there with the water for so long, but it's quite a strong cocktail as is. And I think it probably benefits from a little bit of dilution, if I'm being completely honest. You can add a little bit of soda water or a little bit of water. There's no shame in that, to be honest. So you want to be shaking it for about 8 to 10 seconds until the whole thing is quite cold. And I should have probably said that before I started shaking. And probably not a good idea to talk while I'm doing it either. But there we go. You know, I've done it now. I might give it a little bit more of a shake, but I can feel how cold it is. It's sort of steaming up on the outside. It's normally an indication that it's cold enough to be drank. And there's a bit of a trick to getting these out, because they stick together when they get cold, and you use the sort of palm of your hand, you strike it like that. Quite similar if you've ever done first aid. They tell you to use the sort of heel of your hand to strike someone in the back to dislodge food. Same thing with Boston tins. Just go. There you go. It might take a couple of goes, but it's normally not too difficult. So just fine strain it straight in there. And then add your lemon twist. Mine's not very twisty, but it doesn't matter. There we go. It's a bit of a sorry state, but here it is. And that tastes very strong. It's actually nicer than a lot of the ones I used to make for work, to be fair, because I made it a bit more to my taste than I normally would. It's certainly drinkable, is what I can say about it.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.